Welcome to today's live session. So today we are starting a new course code that is BPSC 144, which is Introduction to South Asia. So from today onwards, we will be learning about South Asia, why we are calling it South Asia, what is there in South Asia, and how South Asia is politically, economically, culturally very vibrant. So we will be learning about all these things in this paper. So, to start with, we are going to know South Asia as a region, that is Unit 1. We will be also doing Unit 2, Struggle for Independence and Nationalism in South Asia. So, in Unit 2, we will be doing it half today, and the another half we will be done in the next session. So, the entire Unit 1 we will be doing today, and half of Unit 2 we will be covering. So let's start with Unit 1, that is South Asia as a region. So what is South Asia and which region is called as South Asia, we will be learning in this unit. And as you can see in the picture, there is a globe, and the green part which is marked, that is the region which is called as South Asia. Also, we will be learning about what are the countries which come in this region and why they are called South Asia. So, first and foremost, let's know what is South Asian countries. What are the countries which comprises the South Asia? So first and foremost, it is India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. So these eight countries together is called as South Asia, and you have to remember all the names of these countries because it is very important to know what are the countries which comes under this region and which comprises this South Asian land. So let's start with the introduction part. South Asia as a region exemplifies the classical definition of what constitutes a region. So the region is itself a area, like we will be talking about what is region. So South Asia is something which is a classical definition of what we can call as a region. So let's see what region means. So a region refers to a landmass consisting of few things which we will be learning. So what are those things which comprises of a region? So first and foremost is the several nation states which are bound together by a common or contiguous geography. So when we can call a place a region when there are several nation states and also they are bound together by a common and contiguous geography. Secondly, they must be connected through historical and civilizational linkages. So when suppose there is a place they don't share their history, they don't have any civilizational linkages, we can't call it as a region. So it is very important that a region must be connected with history. There must be shared history among the countries which can comprise a region. Thirdly, there is overlapping linguistic and cultural identity. So we can call a place region only when there is linguistic and cultural identities overlapping there. So there will be some kinds of similarities, some kinds of connectedness among them, and they will be sharing their culture, their languages, their history, etc. Fourthly, institutionalized form of regional cooperation mechanism. So there must be some kind of cooperation between all these countries among a region. So by following these four categories, we can see that a place a region, and all these four important aspects are present in South Asia, and that is why it is considered to be one of the classical definition of a region. So let's talk about what are the countries which constitute this region, that is South Asia. So constituted of countries including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan. So these are the countries which comprises this South Asia, and each and every one of you should know all the names of these countries which come under South Asia. So the region is a weak in its institutionalized cooperative linkages. So as we learned that for a region, it is very important to have an institutionalized form of regional cooperation, but in the case of South Asia, the cooperative linkages are very weak. The nations, by and large, stand at similar levels of human development and economic growth indicators. So they are quite a bit similar in their human development levels and economic growth indicators. So let's see what is that whether South Asia as a region is already known as South Asia from the inception. No. So earlier the region was known more as Indian subcontinent in the colonial context. So when there was the rule of colonial government in this entire region, so it was known as Indian subcontinent or Southern Asia, implying region to the south of Asia because it is situated. If you see the whole world, if you see that in the map, that the area is somewhere in the southern part of Asia. So that is the region why it is known as Southern Asia or Indian subcontinent during the British colonial times or in the colonial era. So the term South Asia, in terms of its academic genesis, lies in area study departments developed in the West. So considering it as South Asia is something which is Western and it is developed in the area study departments which develop in the West, primarily in the United States of America, to study the Indic thought and culture. So there was a need to study this Indic thought of culture, and for that, the area, the region is known as South Asia. Now, the term is routinely used as a sub regional entity in multilateral institutions like IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organizations, and United Nations, etc. So, it got further formalized with the creation of South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. This is something which is very important. So, it is the short form is SARC. It is known as SARC, and the full form is South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, SARC. So, after forming this SARC, the name South Asia further formalized. Now, let's talk about the geography of South Asia. You can see a picture in the right hand. So, that the areas which is orange in color are part of South Asia. So, South Asia is very much important and very strategically located. So it is very important to know what are the geographical, you can say, advantages that this region is having. So South Asia is one of the most populous region in the world. So the population of this region is very high, and that is why it is also one of the most important region which everyone should consider importance. So it constitutes nearly one-fourth of the world's total population. So you can imagine this region is so populous that the entire world's one-fourth population lives here. So that is why this is very strategically located and also very populous, which makes it a very important region. So this population is regionally dispersed in terms of its ethnic, linguistic, and religious features across the entire subcontinent. So you can say that the population is not uniform. They don't follow same and similar language, religion, etc. But they are regionally dispersed and follows different ethnicities. There is linguistic diversities, religious diversities, etc. in this entire subcontinent. The geographical spread of the region too is quite dispersed and distinct. So we can see the geography of this area, the region is very diversified. Uh, on one hand, there is coastal lines, whereas on the other there is desert. We can also find mountains and hilly areas, whereas we can also find there is a peninsula. So this geography of this region is very diverse. So across with the northern belt, it is characterized by the Himalayan belt. So there is Himalaya in the top, in the northern side, and the southern peninsula characterized by the Deccan Plateau with the Indo-Gangetic and desert plain interspersed in between. So there is Indo-Gangetic plains, there is also desert plain in this region. So these three features intersect the political boundaries between the states of South Asia. thereby making them part of the same geological template. So, apart from this, there are also island states like Sri Lanka and Maldives. There are landlocked states, that is Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. So here, let's talk about what does we mean by island states. We can call a place island when it is covered by water from all the four sides. So Sri Lanka and Maldives are called island states because it is covered by water from all the four sides. The next comes the landlocked states. It is very, very important to know what this landlocked state means. We can call a place or a country a landlocked state or a country when these countries do not have any coastal line. They have no sea, no ocean in as their boundaries. So that is why we can call them as landlocked countries. So what are these landlocked countries or states? It is the Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. You can easily see in the picture how these are landlocked because they don't share in their coastline. So there is no coastal area, there is no ocean, there is no sea. So they can come or they can have a good business through these coastal lines. So that is why these areas are known as landlocked. So these places have their unique sets of geographical features which impinge on their interaction with the outside world. So, by continuing this geography of South Asia, the common geography and contiguous boundary often create problems of political nature, which have often plagued interstate relations in South Asia. So, let's talk about the examples. The first is the cross-boundary river water sharing between India and Pakistan. So, there are many rivers that is shared between many countries. So, the Indus River, which flows from India and Pakistan, it is the river which is shared among India and Pakistan. Similarly, Ganges River is shared between India and Bangladesh, and it also caused friction which were subsequently resolved through negotiated and consensus through Indus Water Treaty and Ganges Water Sharing South Asia as a region treaty. So we have conflict over Indus water also because of the Ganges River, Indus River because of India Pakistan, whereas Ganges India Bangladesh, and these issues are resolved by negotiations, and there are many treaties which solved this problem. For India Pakistan, it is the Indus Water Treaty that happened in 1960s, whereas for India and Bangladesh, it is the Ganges Water Sharing South Asia as a region treaty, which comes in the year 1996. So also there is problems like common and open borders between India and other countries often have been a source of illegal migration and trafficking apart from providing a conduit for terrorism, insurgency from across the state. So because the borders are porous, they are not like you can say the boundaries are now not hard bound boundaries. There are many open borders between India and all other neighboring states. So it became a source of illegal migration, which is these borders are used for that, and also trafficking. So along with this, there is demarcation of maritime borders too has been problematic with disputes such as India Sri Lanka dispute over Park Straits and India Bangladesh maritime disputes in Bay of Bengal area. So as we all know that there is a huge ocean and sea that is having that is there in this region, and because of that there are also maritime borders. What is this maritime borders? There are some nautical miles fixed in the ocean or the sea, which is considered to be like for example, if there is India and Sri Lanka on the same Indian Ocean, there are few kilometers or few nautical miles that is fixed for India as their own territory, whereas apart from that, it is Sri Lanka's area. So this is how the maritime borders are fixed. Now we talked about geography of South Asia. Let's move towards the history of South Asia. So the modern South Asia is an outcome of the political and administrative structures that got created during the British colonial rule. So this region is very much impacted and very much has influence of the British colonial rule because most of these countries which comes under the South Asian region are part of the British colonial rule. So this modern South Asia is, we can say, as an outcome, as a result of this political and administrative structures that got created during that era when Britishers were ruling us. So this region cannot be entirely disconnected with the ancient and medieval influences as well. So they had a very strong and bearing on its distinct identity, culture, and religion. So the region being home to the Indus Valley civilization. So this is very important that we should know, we should understand, and we should remember that this region is the place where Indus Valley civilization was used to happen, used to be there in the ancient time, which is considered to be one of the oldest civilizations in this entire world. So this was a very rich place, very historically and culturally rich place. Also, this region saw the influences of the Aryan Vedic period. There is also emergence of Buddhism in this region. Impact of Islamic rule is also there, which was followed by the British colonialism. So this place is very vibrant historically, and we have seen major changes over the time. So the major flashpoints in South Asian politics in the post-colonial period, when the colonial government got over, it includes the India-Pakistan strife, Bangladesh liberation, Sinhala Tamil strife in Sri Lanka, and the insurgency in the northeast of India. So we can see that after the colonial rule got over, there were many problems which erupted with time. The names, for example, that there is India-Pakistan strife. Bangladesh got liberated after post in the post-colonial time. There is also problem in Sri Lanka among the Sinhalas and the Tamils, and there is insurgency issues in the northeast. So all are in some way or the other an outcome of the kind of politics that got played out during the colonial period and its legacy, which the post-colonial states in South Asia could not effectively address. So there are few problems related to these issues, which South Asia is finding very difficult to manage. Now, let's talk about the politics in South Asia, how the politics is taking shape here. So, the politics in South Asia in the post colonial period has expressed some common yet distinct features. So, this is very important that the politics of South Asia, as I told you, that we have shared common languages, there is a shared history, but the political system are very diversified over this region. So the politics in South Asia in the post-colonial period has expressed some common yet distinct features. So the commonalities can be seen in terms of the Westminster style of parliamentary system that most of the countries have at different times of time followed, and the nature of party system and political mobilization. So there is commonality that most of the countries followed this Westminster style of parliamentary system. The distinctiveness has been more in terms of political processes of managing religious, caste, ethnic, and linguistic diversities. So, at times, the centralization of power and authority has been attempted to contain the diversity, leading to volatile politics in this region. So, many countries in this entire region also faced a time when there is centralization of power and democracy was overthrown. So all these challenges was faced by this region after the colonial rule got over. So while in the recent years, electoral democracy and democratic politics has shown an apparent maturing in South Asia. So over the time, it is the democratic politics and the electoral democracy which is more popular in this region, and every country want to follow this democratic lifestyle. So, but there are also undercurrent of authoritarian politics undermining the same always remains. So there are few countries which goes under the hand of the authoritarian rule, which shapes their politic in a different way than the democratic government can do. So we can let's talk about the politics in South Asia, and particularly the form of government that is found in this region. Always remember, when we are talking about South Asia, it is the 8 countries we are talking about. So it is not about a one country. We are talking about 8 different countries, and there are many differences also along with the commonalities in this region, whether it is politics, geography, or culture. So let's talk about the form of government. Being influenced to a great extent by the colonial history, most countries in South Asia opted for following a Westminster model of parliamentary democracy with bicameral legislature. So, the most of the countries here are following the Westminster model of parliamentary democracy, which we adopted or which we are following because of the our colonial legacy, colonial history, because Britain used to follow this, and that is why we all are the colonies of Britain, or the Great Britain at that point of time it was known as. So after independence also we are following that colonial history, we are following or extending that. That is why we followed their parliamentary democracy. And what is bicameral legislature? Bicameral, bi means two. So there are two houses. If you take example of India, it is the upper house, that is Rajya Sabha, and the lower house, that is Lok Sabha. So there are two houses, and that is how the legislature is working in these areas. So it is following adoption of a new constitution in their respective countries after independence. So all of these countries tried to have a new constitution after the colonial government got over. And also remember that there are few countries in this region which are monarchy. So it took time for those countries to adopt a new constitution. Otherwise, most of the countries followed the concept of making and forming a new constitution. Some countries, on the other hand, followed a quasi presidential system. So, as we can see, the most popular, you can say, most popular type of government or form of government was the parliamentary democracy. But few countries, handful of countries are there who are following the quasi presidential system, with there being direct elections for the president, who in turn act as executive head of the state as well as the government. So, in a parliamentary democracy, we can see that there are two heads: the head of the government, that is the prime minister, whereas the head of the state is the president. But in a presidential system, the head of the government and head of the state both is the president. So, there were stages when some South Asian countries also experimented with constitutional monarchy. As I already told, that there are few countries which are monarchy, and that is why when they tried to adopt constitution, they started practicing the constitutional monarchy. Later it replaced with the parliamentary system. So it is a matter of a few years. So after independence, there are many changes that this region saw. Some of the countries also had a long periods of military rule, or military remained a significant political actor in politics. So we will be knowing about these military rules, the authoritarian governments, how democracy came in, how the constitutional monarchy was working in our this entire unit, rather the entire course. So we will be learning about all these things in detail. Now, let's talk about country-wise how the form of government is there. So, let's talk about India, which is followed by a parliamentary system of government with federal characteristics. So, there being well-defined distributions of power between the center and the states. The upper house of the parliament is known as Rajya Sabha, the Council of States, the lower house as the Lok Sabha. So the prime minister and his cabinet are accountable to the parliament, with the president being head of the state. So I already discussed this in our previous slides. Let's talk about Pakistan. Pakistan too has a parliamentary system with a bicameral legislature, the Senate as the upper house and the National Assembly as the lower house. So you can see that there is a difference in the name. Our In India, the upper house is known as Rajya Sabha and lower house is known as Lok Sabha. Whereas in Pakistan, the upper house is known as Senate, whereas the lower house is known as the National Assembly. In the initial years, Pakistan had a semi-presidential form of government, coinciding with increasing role of military in the government. So nowadays, Pakistan is trying to practice and following the democratic rule or the parliamentary form of government, but initial years were very conflicting and very difficult for Pakistan because it turned into a semi-presidential form of government where military played a very huge role. Now let's come to Bangladesh, which is a unicameral legislature, which is known as Jatiya Sansad. It is unicameral. Uni here means one. As I told you, bicameral, bi means two. So Bangladesh has a unicameral legislature known as Jatiya Sansad. So the Prime Minister and his or her cabinet are appointed by the President. The electoral constituencies in Bangladesh are decided on the basis of districts with specific population. So it is a bit different. Also remember, after Britishers left India and Pakistan were born at the same time, whereas Bangladesh came into being on a very later stage, around 20-21 years later. Bangladesh came into being. So the federal, now let's move on to the Nepal. The federal parliament of Nepal too is having a bicameral legislation. So India, Pakistan, Nepal, three countries having bicameral legislature. Only Bangladesh so far is having a unicameral legislature. The House of Representatives having direct elections from constituencies across its 7 provinces and National Assembly consisting of members elected by electoral college from the provinces. So the office of the president was created in the year 2008 after monarchy was abolished. So Nepal was a monarchy, and it is only in the year 2008 when this monarchy was abolished in Nepal, and the same acts as the head of the state. So it took a very long time for Nepal to abolish monarchy, and uh, it comes with democracy. So the prime minister is head of the government in Nepal, who enjoy the confidence of the majority of the member of the House of Representatives to remain in office. Now let's talk about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a semi-executive presidency adopted after the 1978 constitution. Uh, Let me tell you all that not always it is only one constitution for a country. In India, it is only written once during the initial years of independence. But in many countries, there are few process. There are also many constitutions which are formed over time. Just a minute. In Sri Lanka, the head is very powerful, and the prime minister act as his or her deputy. So earlier, in the initial years, Sri Lanka had a bicameral legislature. In 1972, it made into unicameral with the abolition of Senate, with the National State Assembly or the current parliament being the only house now. So we can see there are many changes that occurred in Sri Lanka over time. Earlier it was something, now it is something. So things changed over time because of some issues in the country. So let's talk about Maldives. Maldives is having a presidential form of government with the unicameral legislature. So the president in complete control of the state of the government. Now let's talk about Bhutan. There is unicameral system in Bhutan, and it became bicameral in the year 2007 with the National Council as the upper house and the National Assembly as the lower house. So Bhutan is also a constitutional monarch where king appoints the prime minister and his cabinet. Now let's talk about the political parties. Political parties in South Asia too have shown certain common characteristics and features in terms of their evolution and performance. So there is Indian National Congress in India, Awami League in Bangladesh, the Ceylon National Congress in Sri Lanka, which later paved the way for the United National Party, were all instances of such party evolutions. So, deepening of democracy took place in the post-colonial period. Many of the countries saw a multi-party system based on political ideology, identity, and ethnicity. So, after the independence, we can see there is a rise and there is a deepening of democracy in all these countries, and because of that, there was a rise of a multi-party system. In Pakistan, there is People's Party, Pakistan's People's Party, Sri Lanka Freedom Party, Nepali Congress. were formed primarily on account of their disillusionment with the ruling party. So they were not happy what the ruling party is doing, and that is why they were created. They were formed. The Bharatiya Janata Party, the leading political party in India today, has been an offshoot of the Bharatiya Jansangh, and the Janata Party coalition has focused on cultural nationalism. Similarly, Bangladesh Nationalist Party with its right of the center nationalist agenda. So there are many parties in these countries which are more towards cultural nationalism and the right of the center. So how these parties are formed. Let's talk about the political processes. So dynastic politics remain a recurrent feature in many political parties across South Asia. So there are many dynasties through which these political parties were growing. So there is Nehru Gandhi family in India, whereas in Pakistan it is the Bhutto Sharif family. In Sri Lanka it is Kumaratunga Rajpaksha family, whereas there in Nepal it is the erstwhile Koirala family which are there in the politics. So it is basically dynastic politics because after generation after generation, the people from these parties are becoming the part of the politics. So the name of the family is seen as instilling memories of struggle, liberation, and sacrifice in the violent political history of the subcontinent, and therefore a key pole plant. So why these are dynastic? Why these parties are getting elected generations after generation? Because they have a connection attached with the struggle, the independence struggle, the movement, the liberation, and that is why they have something memories attached to them. So voters have also given due recognition to the performance of political parties at times, and the dynastic plan had not succeeded. So with time, there are changes in this dynastic politics as well. So the other factors shaping party politics has been the growing trend in religion, the identity-based politics, which is now very much an increase in this region. There are also intra-regional politics which is happening. So the political dynamics has been intrinsic to the individual countries. Their implication of intra-regional politics too have been significantly evident. So the political dynamics that we mentioned above, though have been intrinsic to the individual countries, their implications for intra-regional politics have been significantly evident. So with this, let's talk about the intra-regional politics. India has often become a common dominator in such conflicts. So India is the biggest country in this entire region when we talk about all these 8 countries, and thereby it is considered to be a common denominator, and they affect the foreign relations with other countries concerned. So the genocide and refugee crisis in East Pakistan in the year 1971, India has a very subsequent role in the Bangladesh liberation. Bangladesh was earlier known as the East Pakistan. So it got independence from the Pakistan and it became Bangladesh in the year 1971. There is also Sinhala Tamil conflict in Sri Lanka and India's unsuccessful mediation efforts. So there is always an involvement of India in all these conflicts in different neighboring countries. Nepal's inner political turmoil during struggle against monarchy, and there is also questions of Madheshis which are Indian origin. So you can see that there are involvement of India some way or the other. So these are the issues where India become one of the major denominator. Now let's talk about the South Asia in global geopolitics. So South Asia's location and position in the Asian geopolitical landscape has imparted it a unique space in global geopolitics. So, as I already told you in the beginning, the geopolitics, the global importance of this region is very high. Why? Because of its location, because of its position, and because of its countries. So, it is very important that the countries which comes under this region are very, very important, not only in this entire region but for the outer world as well. It plays a very significant role in the international politics. So it needs to be understood both from a historical as well as a contemporary perspective. So the region is very much framed as a strategic constructing, imparting it a distinct role in the global geostrategy. So it also retained that position, that global position during the Cold War years. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the more recent years, marking uncertainty in global and regional geopolitics, its significance is becoming apparent. So, let's talk about the South Asian politics during the Cold War years. Early Cold War year rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States intersected the deep divide between India and Pakistan on almost similar lines. So, you can see that the in the international sphere, the Cold War was going on between Soviet Union and United States, but it was impacting the relation between two important countries of this South Asian region, that is India and Pakistan. So there was a very deep divide between these two countries because of the Cold War, which was going on in the European and the between the Soviet Union and the United States. So during later years, it became more intensified and directly started shaping politics between the two countries. So India and Pakistan's conflicts are very popular because there are many sphere on which there is conflicts which arose between these two countries. So in during the Cold War years, India adopted the policy of the non-alignment from the year 1960s onwards, and its ideological proximity was evident with the Soviet Union given its 1971 Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Security. So although India adopted the policy of non-alignment, but we can see that there is an ideological proximity of India towards Soviet Union. Pakistan, on the other hand, joined the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization and Central Treaty Organization in the 1950s, which made its intentions clear. So, on the one hand, we are following non-line movement, whereas on the other hand, Pakistan was joining the organizations of these majorly the countries which are involved in the Cold War. Despite the fact that both the countries became members of the non-aligned movement later, it did nothing to shift or alter their respective affinity to the two major powers. So Pakistan was more closer to the United States, whereas India has a close proximity with the Soviet Union. So now we can see that how during the war on terror South Asia was behaving. So the other significant phase which came in the 1990s following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. So there was an you can see Soviet Union involved in Afghanistan's politics, and it became a very important issue which further gave rise to the Cold War, which is known as New Cold War. So at that point of time, a significant chunk of the terror infrastructure from Pakistan now being directed against India through the cross-border terrorism, which had already seen a rise since 1980. So the number of terrorism events, terrorism issues arose during this time, and South Asia came to be regarded as a global flashpoint after the two countries conducted nuclear tests in the year 1998, raising the specter of a nuclear confrontation between the two rivals. So, why South Asia is also very important for the global politics and for the international relations? Because two of the countries which comes under this region has the nuclear weapon. So, in the year 1998, around the two countries conducted their nuclear test, and in a region when two countries are rivals and also having nuclear bombs, it is very important because there is a speculation and there is a fear that in any kind of confrontation among these two rivals, there is a chance of nuclear attack as well. So, in the year 2001, because of the 9/11 attacks in the United States, which further brought US back into the picture, as Pakistan again became a key ally as a frontline state in the war on global terror. So, again, the Pakistan had a very close connection with United States, while India-Pak relations continued to deteriorate during the subsequent years. Despite occasional signs of a potential thaw, the region failed to pick up on some good starts on cooperative initiatives that had been undertaken under the SAARC umbrella. The full form of SAARC I already told you in the previous slide. So it is Very, very important to know what is the full form of SAARC. So, due to SAARC or after formation of the SAARC, it was believed that there should be some kind of cooperation among these countries, but it is very hard to find any good growth. Now let's talk about South Asia and China. China is another factor why importance of South Asia in a regional and global geopolitics is likely to remain. So being in the immediate vicinity of the South Asian neighborhood, China's geographical presence can certainly not be denied. So although China is not part of this region, not part of the South Asian region, but because of its close proximity, because it is a neighbor of South Asia, it has its own role to play. So, however, China has been gradually converting this into a geopolitical advantage by its Belt and Road Initiative and initiating a number of big ticket infrastructure projects like the Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, Wada Port in Pakistan, Mongla Port in Bangladesh, the China Pakistan Economic Corridor CPEC, and the road and rail projects in Nepal. So these are few projects, infrastructure projects, which China is undertaking in this entire region, and that is why it is becoming more and more involved with South Asian politics. So these are indicators that it has already made a deep entry into South Asia, overcoming the geographical disadvantage vis-a-vis India. So let's talk about the economic development and cooperation in South Asia. So South Asia is known to be a test case for the economic development, and the region faces enormous challenges like human development, reflecting on its poverty, education, health, and therefore the quality of life of majority of its people. So there are many challenges that this region is facing. So the quality of human life is central to the overall economic well-being of a society, nation, and the region, and South Asia is no exception to this. So if one sees within the South Asia, there are possibilities of economic growth and economic demographic dividend in South Asia as a region if the growth spread in as even across the regions and sectors. So there is high possibilities of economic growth, but the spread of the growth is not even. It is uneven, and that is the reason why the region as a whole is not moving ahead. So, unfortunately for South Asia, the Regional Economic Cooperation Project too has faltered, and its ability to gain any momentum whatsoever in addressing many of the economic problems and opportunities in a collective manner is not up to the mark. So, there is no, you can say, connectedness or linkages on which they can work and can grow together. So let's talk about the human development in South Asia. So on the basis of their UN's human development ranking among the total of around 190 countries, most of the countries stand at the lower quarter. That is a very sad reality. The UNDP's Multidimensional Poverty Index, MIP in short, looks at deprivations experienced by people at various levels that includes education, health, standard of living. And this MPI 2021, which studies 109 countries, points out that nearly half of the world's total poor people, which comprises around 532 million of people, are residing in this South Asia alone. So this is something which should be considered important, because half of the population of poor are residing in this region. So these deprivations are known to get exacerbated across gender, ethnicity, and caste, and these are something which requires policy formations. If we talk about the economic growth in South Asia, the rate of economic growth has shown some positive indicators. So, more recently, if we talk during the COVID outbreak, the global and the regional economy comes to terms with the post-COVID situation. The World Bank projected that the region to grow by 7.1% in the year 2021 and 2022, even though it may remain fragile. So there are expectation of its growth, and which would be led by the digitalization and service led sectors. Also, it should be known that, however, there are some underscores the need for systemic attention to the agricultural sector on which the bulk of population is still dependent. So in this region, agriculture is the major source through which people used to earn, because that is the one of the major occupation or major sector on which the major number of population is dependent. Also, the labor sector still is organized, which should be taken seriously. Now let's see about the regional cooperation. So the region did make a good start with the creation of South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation in the year 1985. The progress in the initial decades was gradual yet focused with emphasis on areas like poverty alleviation, trade liberalization, etc. So initially when SARC was created, there was a focus on how these poverty alleviation, trade liberalization should be uh, the focus, and the work should be done on these areas for better development. SARC countries also attempted forming common positions on forum like World Trade Organizations on matters of agriculture, textiles, and patents. Though political issues were kept out of deliberations, SARC still managed with bits of political friction investing in on the SARC platforms, but not derailing the entire process. So initially it was going quite smoothly, but during the last 5 years, there was a complete breakdown of communication between the India and Pakistan, which stalled the process to such an extent that questions are being raised about the viability of the SARC process itself. So initially there were many problems that SARC was facing, but still it was going on. But during the last 5 years, the connection between India and Pakistan just derailed this process, and there is a question on SARC now. So, India's growing inclination towards the trans-regional partnerships rather than its immediate neighborhood appears to be putting its neighborhood first policy on a back foot. So now India is focusing on trans-regional partnership more than the neighborhood first policy. So in the ideal sense of the term, both are co-terminus with each other, and a calibrated neighborhood policy can create the basis for a more enlightened trans-regional policies. So with this, we are done with our unit 1. Let's move forward to unit 2, and today we will be completing unit 2 in the half portion. The another half will be done in the next session. So this unit 2 talks about the struggle for independence and nationalism in South Asia, which is a very important important unit, because it will let you know the base, how these entire 8 countries come out from the colonial struggle, and how these countries and what are the challenges they are facing, how they are finding problems after establishing their own independent country. So let's introduce this unit, that is struggle for independence. So now see, South Asia has a continuous history of 7,000 years. So it is nothing that South Asia is newly formed, or South Asia is not that much united because of their history, but we can say that it has a history of 7,000 years. It has a composite culture developed through a historical process wherein the emphasis has been on unity in diversity. So this region thrives because it believes in unity in diversity. South Asia has been a victim of repeated foreign aggression. It is very important to understand, because this entire region were affected because of these foreign aggressions, and the richness of the region perhaps attracted the aggressors from far and wide. So why there is repeated foreign aggression? Because the South Asian region was so rich, not only because of the resources, also because of its culture, ethnicities, and because of its geography. So that is why these lands attracted the foreign aggressors. In the successive waves of invasion since the ancient times, there comes the Aryans, the Greeks, the Shakas, the Huns, the Turco-Afghans, the Mughals from other region, and in the modern period, it is the Europeans like the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and finally the Britishers who came to the South Asia. It was the British who finally established their hold in the region. So, The British invasion was qualitatively different from the earlier ones. So there were many foreign aggressors came from different part of the world, but British invasion was different from all the others. So the earlier invaders came, they settled down here and got completely assimilated with the indigenous people. They got used to the people, the environment, and they just settled down. All the aggressors who came early, they settled down, but they came as an invader. The British integrated the region into the empire and ruled it from London. So the earlier foreign aggressors who came here, they settled down here, but the British, they created this region as its part of empire, and it was ruled from London. So the South Asian economy and society became subordinated to this imperialist political economy and social development. Also, this region was transformed into a market of the British machine made goods and a source of raw material and foodstuffs and an important field of capital investment. So, Britishers, what they used to do, they created this entire region as their market, and they used to sell their machine made products, and also they extracts the raw material from this area and their foodstuffs, and this is why the Britishers are different from the earlier aggressors. So the entire structure of economic relation between Europe and the South Asia involving trade, finance, technology continuously developed the colonial dependence and underdevelopment of the latter. So what happened is people living in this entire South Asian region, they gradually became dependent on this colonial government, and that is when their underdevelopment started taking place. So, this new politico economic system of subordination, called as colonialism, resulted in the emergence of Europe as a leading capitalist region. And while these colonies were reduced to backward and underdeveloped regions of the world, so by colonizing these areas, Europe was becoming a capitalist region, whereas on the other hand, these colonies were becoming more underdeveloped and backward. So in course of time, the economic and political domination led to numerous conflicts and contradictions, which ultimately resulted in the growth of nationalism and movements for independence from colonial rule. So, because of all these conflicts, all these problems that these people were facing, there was a growth of nationalism and movements for independence struggle. So, let's talk about the nationalism in South Asia. So there are three patterns of colonial governance in the region, whereas the British Indian Empire embraced the area which covered the present independent republics of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and governed it as crown colony. Also, there were smaller states like Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, which were not the British colonies but were their protectorates. So, what this protectorate means? It means in return for surrendering their autonomy over their external relations, their independent existence was protected by the Britishers. So, nationalism in South Asia emerged as a reaction against this colonial exploitation and subjugation. So, the regions which were under the direct control of the colonial administration witnessed strong anti-colonial and nationalist movement. So the new form of nationalism that became basis of new states in South Asia derived much of its ideology and political theory from the West. So this new form of nationalism were derived from this ideology and political theory was derived from that of the West. So, but it was adopted to particular circumstances and experiences. So the basis of this new nationalism was an instinctive and xenophobic hatred for the imperialism and symbols of imperialism. So it was simply a kind of hatred against those who occupied their land by force, exploited the riches by force, crushed their government, and enslaved their people. So there was a common hatred among these colonizers. So nationalism has also become a creative force which aimed at building a nation based upon the principles of liberty, independence, economic justice, and nationality, which was not there in the colonial period. So, this was something that all the countries of this region was aiming for. So it not only united the people but also inspired them to contribute their share in the national reconstruction. This also led to, in this regard, was given by India, which produced one of the biggest mass movements in the world. And this movement also succeeded, freeing up from the colonial clutches, and it also gave inspiration to the other countries. So let's talk about the freedom struggle in South Asia. Let's start with India. So we will be covering Indian freedom struggle in today's lecture. The other countries, we will be learning about those in our next session. So let's talk about India. So the rise and growth of nationalism in India was the product of the interaction of numerous objectives and subjective forces. It emerged in the historical process during the British colonial rule. So the process was still going on when the British colonial rule was at its peak. So while colonialism resulted in the economic exploitation of India and destruction of its agriculture and handicrafts, it also led to the political and administrative unification of India. So not only colonialism did economic exploitation and destruction, but also it unified the political and the administrative areas. The national movement, the Indian national movement, passed through various phases. With each passing phase, there is a social base broadened. So it is a very positive sign for a movement when its social base gets broadened up. So the first phase of the national movement began in 1885 with the formation of Indian National Congress. And during this phase, the leadership was in the hands of the leaders like Dadabhai Nauroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, M.G. Ranade, S.N. Banerjee, and Firoz Shah Mehta, etc. At this stage, the objective of the movement was not freedom but political and administrative and economic reforms. So earlier, the movement was for more role to played by the Indians. At the political level, the demand was to reform the central and the local legislative councils so as to secure more power for the Indian representatives. Whereas at the economic level, the demand was for the industrialization of the country and the promotion of the Indian industries. A new phase of the Indian national movement began with the entry of Mahatma Gandhi. So earlier, as I already told you that the movement were happening in different phases. A new phase rose up in when there was the advent of Mahatma Gandhi in the picture. So when the World War II broke out, the British declared war on India's behalf without consulting the Indian leaders. So in the year 1942, the Congress demanded that Britishers should immediately quit India and pass the famous Quit India resolution. Do remember that before this Quit India movement, there were enormous movement that was led by Mahatma Gandhi, like non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement. But this Quit India movement was something which was very important because the agitation, the strikes, the demonstrations was happening in all parts of India, and it was an ultimatum given to the Britishers to immediately quit the country. So, police stations, post offices, railway stations were attacked during this Quit India movement, and communication wires were cut and railway lines were destroyed to show to show the anger towards the Britishers, towards the colonial rule. So, this phase showed that if need be, the Indian people could take the route of violence and end the British imperialism. So, on 20th of February 1947, the British Prime Minister announced his government's decision to quit India before June 1948. So, Lord Mountbatten was to be sent to India to make arrangements for this transfer of power from the Britishers to the Indians. So, this Mountbatten's formula was that the country would be divided, but also Punjab and Bengal, so that the limited Pakistan that emerged would meet both the Congress and the League positions to some extent. So, this formula of partition and independence was accepted by all of the major political parties, and this is how India got independence in the year 1947, 15th of August. So, up to this, we will be continuing the Unit 2 in our next session, along with Unit 3 that talks about diversity, pluralism, and South Asia. With this, I end our session.